Hi, Shanaka. Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it. So seeing as you're a lawyer, an actor, a journalist, commentator, we have a lot to cover, so we'll jump straight into it. You've just returned from the Birmingham Theatre Festival and the Edinburgh Theatre Festival, where you've been taking part in the play Counting and Cracking. So I'll leave it to you to just tell us a little bit about it. But just for our audience, I want to note that the play Counting and Cracking was given rave reviews by the press in the United Kingdom. Just two places are, quote, a vital tale for our times, a touching and gorgeously staged tale by the Scotsman, and a beautiful spectacle, the Herald. So would you like to tell us a little bit about Counting and Cracking?
Yeah, we were really happy to get 5-star reviews from the Times and 4 stars from the Guardian. So it was a really well-received play, Kusum, and I'm just so privileged to have been a part of it. It's a story about 4 generations of a Tamil family, and of course their singular friends, their singular relatives, their staff, all of that. And how that spans 1956, which was a watershed year in Sri Lanka historically, 1983, which was another really strong year in terms of the Tamil people's history, and then in 2004 with the ceasefire, how those families come back together, how the splinters are brought back. So it is a play that spans 4 generations, 3.5 hours, which just goes by in a flash because it's just such a well-told story. Story that I think has needed to be told for perhaps the last 40 years or so. And finally, we're seeing somebody, and it's not a Sri Lankan even, not really a resident Sri Lankan, who's coming out and being brave enough to tell this story, and I think it was fantastic to be a part of that.
It's the kind of thing that needs to be discussed more in Sri Lanka, I assume. It's the kind of story
I think so. I think
should find an audience here.
I hope it does find an audience, but I had a very interesting response from somebody who traveled to watch the play in Birmingham. And he said, you know, I was watching this story, and he was my age, so he was 5 years old when 1983 happened. Okay. And he said, look, I was watching the other people in the audience, and when he's talking about other people, he's talking about people from other nationalities, local British people, and you know, other people that had come to see the play. And he said he saw them being so moved by the play, by the content of it, by the story, by the emotions, that he felt he almost had permission to start feeling about that event in history. And that's something that I found really interesting, because I was wondering if it was a completely Sri Lankan audience, we being ourselves, we might just shut down and be like, no, you know what, that never happened, no, that's not an accurate story, and just purse our lips and just walk out and pretend nothing has happened. But being in a different environment, I think it hit people, Sri Lankans who watched it, and several did, it hit them in a really different way. It was nice to see how other people empathized with our conflict and the fallout of those conflicts.
I mean, I was born in the mid-80s, so you're a little bit older, but do you remember that time? Because my reference point for our conflict is the 90s. Mm-hmm. I don't remember much from the 80s at all, to be honest with you. So how do you remember from your childhood growing up, especially being in the local school system, how did you feel about within St. Thomas's and within your social groupings? Do you remember much in the late 80s, for example? Was it?
Well, mid to late 80s, yes, I do, Kusum, because I had, I don't know whether it's the privilege or the misfortune of having a father in the military.
Right.
And so he was very much actively involved in the conflicts, where he was in Mathura during the JVP times, and then he was mobilized operationally in Jaffna, in Ampara, in Kokilai, in Padavia, you know, all those areas that were pretty hard hit. So I probably had a first row seat to how things were going, and I remember how he used to have to leave, and you know, as a small child you don't really process the thought of, is he going to come back? But looking back, you know, I look at how my mother would have had to deal with that, and yes, so I do remember it quite well. And I think there are a lot of people also who were similarly affected, who don't really have an outlet, who even 40 years later find it very difficult to talk about. So, and that's just the people who are family, but the people who are actually involved in the conflict, soldiers, foot soldiers, to officers, to combatants, to LTT cadres who have been rehabilitated. What are we doing about their PTSD? What are we doing about their stories? How are we telling their stories? So it's a huge can of worms that I don't think anyone's willing to open.
So you must have had the play itself must have had a certain emotional response from within you, because being a Sri Lankan, being around in that area, you mentioned it was over 3.5 hours long. Could you tell us a little bit about the dynamic you build with an audience over such a period of time. I mean, you just told me off camera that you were on stage for 35% of the time. So you must need to have a lot of investment from the audience as well, because it's a long play. But at the same time, it's emotionally charged. So tell us a little bit about how you approach that.
It's a long play, but it's also a beautiful play, Kusum. It's just, Shakti's play is just an outstanding piece of writing. And I spoke to people who watched it more than once. And the thing about Act 1, it's just 1 hour long, and it draws you in, it gives you who the characters are, it tells a little bit of a backstory about the characters, sets the context. And then Act 2, which is also about just over an hour long, it has some big scenes. There's an iconic wedding scene. And then there's a couple more family scenes that really kind of hug you, but at the same time punch you while you're in a clinch almost. So I think people are left at the end of Act 2 with like wondering, wow, you know, this is pretty powerful. And then Act 3 is pretty much a second-hand narration of the events of the day on 1983 in Black July, and how this family goes through that, how people, whether they were in the Sinhalese or Tamil community, how they actually dealt with that day, and the violence that ensued without really acting it out. It was just a suggestion of what was going on in on the streets that day, and I remember a bit of it. I remember the mob marching down. When I lived on Dickman's Road at the time, and I remember like 35, 40 people, and I look back now and I'm thinking, okay, there was 35, 40 guys with machetes and clubs and stuff walking down the street, but there's thousands of the rest of us. Why weren't we on the street like we were on the 9th of May? So that for me was a really nice turning point to see on the 9th of May. Although I abhor what actually happened, it was nice to see people are not just sitting back and watching their compatriots getting brutally beaten and attacked. So maybe the worm has turned. Maybe we are not going to be that kind of a nation anymore, but we'll find out soon enough.
I mean, it sounds like a fantastic play, Shanaka. What are the chances of it being brought down to Sri Lanka? Do you think we can work something out? Or?
I hope so. I hope that the powers that be will realize the power of showing something like this. It's a trilingual play as well.
Okay, excellent.
So yeah, we've got English, Sinhala, Tamil. We've had people who are coming in from India. We had Australians all learning the Tamil language, all learning the Sinhala language from scratch in order to be able to perform this authentically. So it's a play that really needs to travel the length and breadth of Sri Lanka, not just Colombo. And we need to be able to see ourselves from the audience point of view, I think, and watch what might have happened differently if we just were a little bit more mindful.
Right. You were twice awarded the Best Actor prize at school. You led your school in shakes to victory, I think I read in your profile. So you have a deep resume as an actor. I mean, Glenn Ross playing Doctor. Also Midnight's Children, the movie, and based on the novel by Salman. Could you tell us a little bit about Midnight's Children? What was it like being in a pretty major production?
Well, it was a major production, but I think Deepa Mehta does her major productions here because it's a lot cheaper for her.
Yeah, of course, of course.
So I'm under no illusion of that. But I played a nice little scene where I'm actually the one that tells the family that their children have been switched. So that was quite interesting for me. But it was nice to be part of that production, and it was very professional also. And it was also good to be a part of a professional production in Australia, where we rehearsed for 3 weeks before going over to Edinburgh. And just sometimes I wonder how we even put on a play here in Sri Lanka, given the lack of resources and the professionalism with which they do things, approach things. And it was the first time in my life, I think, that I've been able to just act and not have to worry about pasting posters, printing tickets, finding sponsors, you know, who's going to do front of house, that kind of stressors, without all that. So it was a really liberating experience as an actor for me, and I'm really grateful to have had it.
Had you previously had any experience with Midnight's Children, the novel? Salman Rushdie recently was brutally attacked for the thing. How did you, I mean, isn't it strange that I think the fatwa on his head was in the late 80s, and it still continues today. It's quite something, isn't it?
It is, and you know, you have to doff your hat to the man for being able to annoy people for the last 30 years.
Yeah, he must have really annoyed some people.
Yeah, but free speech is a huge talking point, isn't it, Kusum? So I don't think we're going to find any easy answers, but extremism in whatever form is something that I think we need to be really skeptical of.